So we're going to call the meeting to order. This is being recorded for BV10, BTV10, and DJ Brown is doing the recording this evening. Fiona, could you call the roll, please?
Rod Burton,
Here.
Sarah Campbell,
Here.
Kurt Carpenter,
Here.
David Christensen, Lynette Felber, Mary Rossi, Jean Milius, Alexander Wiley. Thank you.
So I'd like to introduce some people in the city tonight. We're here tonight. The mayor is here. I don't see where she is right now. Oh, there, Mayor Linville.
Mayor Kelly.
Mayor Kelly. And the Planning and Community Development staff, Kurt Nabefeld, Katie Franks, Development Specialist 2, Kate Newell, GIS Analyst, and Jackie Lynch, Planner 2, and Fiona Starr, our Recording Secretary. Also here tonight we have Michael Sullivan of Artifacts Consulting, and Michael Hauser from the Washington State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. And we're really glad both of you are here, since you're going to be doing the presentation. The authority of the Historic Preservation Commission to hold public meetings is set forth in Title 17.90 of the Bellingham Municipal Code. So the meeting tonight is to review the draft Downtown Bellingham National Historic District nomination. There'll be time for public comments and questions after the presentation, and we'll start by turning it over to Mayor Linville, to Mayor Kelly.
That's too formal. So first of all, we skipped an elected official.
Uh-oh.
We skipped an elected official that's
Terry
here,
Borneman?
Terry Borneman, who is on our city council. And I always like to acknowledge council members that attend these meetings because this is really important that they hear from everybody. So thank you, Terry, for being here tonight. The question I was supposed to ask is, why are we doing this? And I personally, before we start, I want to say that one of the reasons we're doing this is because Katie Franks did an assessment of all the historic buildings in downtown Bellingham. Am I close?
Yeah, well, actually, Michael did all.
Okay, Michael did all the work, but then yeah, but the main thing was, I had been reading about historic redevelopment, and many of the projects that were being put forward down in King County and other places were not the great big buildings like we're doing the federal building, not some of the large buildings that Bob and David have looked at restoring, but smaller historic buildings that would be achievable for a lot of different people to be able to restore, so that they can become part of our downtown character. There are a lot of, I think there's a lot of interest in tourism in his, what do you call it? I was going to say hysterical tourism, but
Heritage.
yeah, that's right. Heritage tourism. At least when I go places, I like to see the old buildings and I like to see the museums and I like to see what people have done to repurpose the buildings that were here. We're not a young city, we're not an old city, but we're not a young city. And we have many buildings that have historical significance that would be nice to allow the public to be in now or have a new business, especially downtown. So all I know is that I'm glad you're all here tonight. Here comes Dave. Yeah. I'm usually late. That's you. But it's wonderful to have you all here tonight. Our staff has taken a real interest in this, and I appreciate that. And I would like to see something come of this potential historic downtown designation. So I'm old, 66, so I probably went to some of these old buildings before they boarded them up. But I look at the Flame and Railroad Avenue and what's happened. I look at what's happening with the Herald Building right now. So I'm excited, and I hope that something comes out of this that will motivate many people to say, I want to be a part of historic downtown Bellingham, and I want to be one of the people that restores a building, a business, a public space. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Rob, right? Okay, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Mayor Kelly. So Katie will start the presentation, I guess.
Did you ever turn this on now? Right. Hello? Am I on? Oh, I am. Okay. I'm Katie Franks. Let's see. Listen for 1 minute. Let's see. Okay. I'm just going to introduce Michael and Michael. Michael Sullivan from Artifacts Consulting in Tacoma. He is he loves Bellingham. He went to Western and he worked for the county as the first historic preservation officer way back in the 70s, the 80s. And since then, he's been coming back to Bellingham and doing a lot of work for us, some of it without pay. He loves it that much. So it was really great to get him and his team to work on the downtown historic district. So he's going to give a presentation about the history and why the boundaries look the way they do, and some of the historical significance that's embedded in this nomination. And then Michael Hauser, he is the state architectural historian all the way from Olympia. He's a great guy, and he knows a lot about architecture and also about the National Register of Historic Places. And he's going to explain what it means to be a historic district. So I'm going to turn it over to the two of them, but not before I thank all the people that worked on this. It's not only Artifacts, but we had several volunteers. Jim Talbot was one of them. He's in the audience, right? Former commissioner. Jeff Jewell. We all know Jeff. He has an amazing mind for history and knows all the photographs. We owe all that to him. And then Lynette Felber, one of our commissioners, actually is working on helping us hone the nomination. And the nomination that went out and is on the web, it's a draft, and we really want to perfect it. And a couple of people have come to me and said, oh, I have more information, and we would love that if you can give it to me in the next couple of days. That'd be great. But this will be what we're going to put it forward. We're going to make it the best we can, and then hopefully get it listed in the National Register.
Hello, everybody. It's good to be here. I'm always struck by, having gone to school here, the best cities, the best places you visit, always leave you with some kind of a story. They tell something about themselves, and that's usually based in authenticity, something about a place that conveys the events of the past or some values out of the past. And too often you go to somewhere and it just feels fake. I mean, it just doesn't seem real. And, if it's Disneyland or whatever, it can be a thrill for a while, but somehow it just doesn't have a lasting meaning. And unfortunately, I think since the post-war years, a lot of cities have just kind of errantly and without thinking about it allowed important parts of their memory, important pages in their diary to just be torn out and discarded. And the result is these kind of broken places that really don't tell a story. They don't really reveal anything authentic about themselves. And we see a lot of that. And I think, one of the things that is authentic about places are the buildings and the built environment and the products of human endeavor that come from the past that still make up a part of the present. So I'm going to talk about the history and a little bit about the diary and a little bit about the narrative of Bellingham, but I didn't want to do that without making a point about the future and about the way we plan cities looking forward. Too often, planning policies and programs, growth management techniques kind of function in a state of amnesia. They're entirely focused on the future, and there's almost a premise there that everything that's there now is replaceable. And I would like to argue that the point of doing a National Register nomination is to counter that frame of mind and to say that the first part of the planning process should be a deliberate effort to say, what do we keep? Because that's the irreversible decision at the very beginning. Then you can plan your highways or your roads or your zoning or whatever it may be, develop your building codes, whatever they may be. But at the very beginning, you have to be smart about what you hold on to. And more times than not, it's the things that are with us, that have endured, that have lasted, that exemplify the kinds of goals we want to have in our planning. Sustainability, the continued use of resources that are already there, a sense of not just throwing things away and filling our landfills up. All those things are there, and they're embedded in the decision about what do we keep in terms of planning. So what Michael and I are going to talk about, Michael 1 and Michael 2, is a little bit about one of the tools using National Register and local codes and preservation tools to be able to be smart about what we keep and hold on to that and not allow accidentally to lose our narrative, to lose our authenticity. And Bellingham, admittedly, I am, unapologetically, a lover of Bellingham. So there may be some, blinding in my judgment, but there are few cities that I've been to in America, and especially in the Pacific Northwest, that tell as complete a story about themselves as Bellingham does. The city that started, during the 1849 California gold rush, really out of that time, all the way up to the present, has a complete narrative here. We don't have any big holes, we don't have any big missing parts in the understanding of the city's history that's here. And that's pretty remarkable if you think about it. In America, in the beginning of the 21st century, that we've got a city that's been around for 160, 170 years, and we haven't created any holes in the way that we've made decisions about what we keep. So anyway, sorry about that little rant. But anyway, I wanted to kind of quickly go through, and admittedly, this is a very impressionistic view. The way I see Bellingham, just through the years, a little bit about what we have, and how the story kind of unfolds in the city. Just threw that in because this is one of those dreamy bird's eye views, one of those animations, one of those fantasy ideas about what the city would be. And this is one of those things that some artists drew up somewhere back east. What gives it away as sheer fantasy is the fact that when that painting was done, there was absolutely no way in the world for any human being to get to that point of view of the city, because you couldn't fly yet, and there wasn't any way to get up in the air to be able to see that unless you had wings. So that's a pure fantasy view. So I guess that's where the city begins, even back to the time of Wilkes and even to native people. There's an idealized sense of Bellingham Bay and the immediate intimate area around Whatcom Creek as being a place that would be home for people. There's lots of really early pictures, but as I already said, and we all know kind of the origin story of Bellingham, I think, the Rotor Party coming here. Really in the days of the California gold rush, where people had to come all the way around to be able to get to California, and San Francisco grows up, and everybody's crazy about getting gold, and the city's made out of wood, and all the buildings are heated by stoves, and so San Francisco burns down every 6 or 8 months, and they run out of forests, and so pretty soon they're coming up. The coast is not friendly for sailing ships to be able to get in to cut trees, so they come all the way up to Puget Sound. And it's all in that 1852, 1853 that the first American settlers come in and begin to establish all the cities that we have pretty much. Seattle, Tacoma, Olympia, Port Townsend, Bellingham, all kind of happen within a year or two of one another, with settlers coming up and using the newly created donation land claim system from 1850. So anyway, Bellingham starts out that way, and Bellingham is a really good port for sailing ships. It's really beautifully oriented to the prevailing wind from the southwest, so it's ideal. It's obvious this would be the place, a good place to be able to settle in. But unfortunately, the customs station was established at Port Townsend. That pulled most of the activity out in the channel on the other side of the San Juan Islands. And so Bellingham, it's not a backwater, but it's hidden back out of the mainstream for shipping activity and stuff going in. And it develops pretty much its own raison d'etre, its own purpose for being, its own style. It's totally unique from the other cities deeper down into Puget Sound in terms of its purpose. And the fact that it's always really, really close to the Canadian border, the international border, and the fact that there's always a healthy, large native population right nearby has a big role in shaping the way the city socially and physically develops. I love this picture because, before I move on, memorize that picture because we'll come back to one from the 40s that shows basically that same view. So by the 1880s, what really made the far west was that during the Civil War, I always love this about Abraham Lincoln, one day in the middle of the Civil War where Lincoln would have just been numbed by the reports daily of casualties and munitions and, strategies for fighting the Civil War, that one day a group of geographers came in and sat down with him, and Lincoln had the clarity and the ability to isolate a thought that he wanted to see a transcontinental railroad built that would basically retrace the route of Lewis and Clark. It would be to Thomas Jefferson. The Transcontinental Railroad was to Lincoln what Lewis and Clark's journey was to Thomas Jefferson. Did I say that right? Anyway, you get my point. It's 1873, finally, when the charter, the railroad that Abraham Lincoln charters in 1864 and would never see the end of, but in 1873, the tracks reached saltwater on Puget Sound down at Tacoma. And from the middle of the 1870s through the 1880s and 1890s, everybody's chasing the railroad. Every city on water wants to bring a railroad spur in. And luckily, Bellingham had a direct connection with Nelson Bennett, who was a principal with the Northern Pacific Railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, and that accelerated the development of railroad tracks coming up to Bellingham. The other thing that happened was the Canadians were pushing a transcontinental railroad, and they wanted access into the United States, and Bellingham was also on the path for the railroads coming through. So the railroads begin to have a really instrumental influence on the way the city is planned. In the earliest days of Roeder and the days before the coming of the railroad, Bellingham, all of the development, the buildings, the commercial downtown is all focused to the waterfront because everything came and went by sea. With the arrival of the railroad, when rails meet sails, the city itself begins to turn and starts to really develop as this sort of translator between the steam age energy of the Transcontinental Railroad and the technology it brought and access to the Pacific Rim, to Asia. I always love to tell people, the reason that the railroad could come all the way across the country on one track, you ever see a picture of the railroad going across the desert? There's only one track. And yet trains are going east and west, right? It's because in that picture there should always be telegraph poles and a telegraph line, because that's how they kept the from eastbound from running into the westbound, was because they communicated by telegraph. Well, it was the telegraph that made it possible. If the railroad came to you, the telegraph came. And now you can wire money. And that's where the newspapers are going to be, because you have information. It's like the internet being delivered. That really makes your city. So the arrival of the railroad in Bellingham really, really made a big difference in the way the city functioned. And Railroad Avenue develops. From the early days, the city was kind of shaped by two land plats, one by Roeder and one by Peabody, kind of on diagonals that created that kind of chaos downtown of the two grids that crashed together. Now the railroad comes in on the side, and that smooths out the tension and the confusion in the downtown. Sort of takes the Roeder plat out of the city and shifts the shape of the city and the plan of the city up further to the south around Railroad Avenue. And Railroad Avenue will become the central spine. It will become the central organizing point for commerce and goods and activity and passengers and tourism and all those things that'll happen along Railroad Avenue. Railroad Avenue, though, isn't a commercial fancy, it's not where you went to, to demonstrate your latest new fancy hat on Sunday. Railroad is a steam, smoke belching, freight, horses, everything all in one big place. So it's great. And I wish I had time to tell you this story, because there's one of the best. Actually, Jeff knows the story behind this picture, but E.A. Haig took this photo. Another time I'll tell you the story of what happens here. But anyway, that's Railroad Avenue, arrival of the first locomotive regular service. Parallel then to railroad, now railroad's established, and the emphasis on the waterfront begins to shift. You know, when you look at down on the waterfront today, you can kind of see the old high bank, the escarpment that runs behind Old City Hall, and you can kind of see the way the buildings along the high edge that run parallel to Old City Hall kind of loom over look down over the waterfront. That's where that picture was taken. In those days when shipping was everything, that was kind of the important edge, and that's why City Hall was perched up on top, so that when you were coming in by ship, you were impressed by City Hall. Ooh, looming, it's an important city. Now when the railroad comes in, we build a big train station on Railroad Avenue, and parallel to Railroad, State Street develops, and it's along State Street that the businesses of the new town of Seaholm begin to develop. And here's where you have hotels and the cleaner parts of the city, if you will, and also the more retail and kind of the business side of the city. The place where ladies in summer dresses could walk and not worry about having mud splattered all over. So by the 1890s, you can kind of see we're starting to get some pretty impressive brick buildings. The old wood buildings that burned down like San Francisco all the time are suddenly now being replaced by red brick masonry buildings, fireproof buildings. And these buildings start to reflect some of the high style of cities even on the east. And a lot of those ideas are coming out on the railroad. Classically trained architects are making their way out to the frontier, and Bellingham gets its fair share of important designers with a real sensibility about how cities should look at the turn of the century. And here down on Holly Street, you've kind of a building that's still with us. You start to get a feel for some aspects of the building that isn't just a brick pen anymore. It's got architecture. It's got flash and style and character and style, like these ladies with their hats on the corner. Kind of jumped, from 1900. I didn't have a picture from 1910, but I don't want to forget that 20-year period, because Bellingham, like the other cities in the far west, really go through a growth jolt between 1900 and the First World War. Probably more buildings were built in Bellingham between 1900 and, say, 1920 than any other 20-year span in the city's history. That's probably the biggest growth. The most enduring buildings all kind of come from that period. And even to this day, where we have, out on Meridian, all that crazy stuff going on, square footage, I'm sure that exceeds it if you were to take the last 20 years. But in terms of prominent buildings downtown, I would guess that's probably the biggest growth time for the city. Most of the buildings in the historic district are going to date from that period, from 1900 to about 1920. That's going to be the era when we're going to have most of the properties. And I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to jump over that, but and won't use examples. But that's also the time where rail for freight, passengers, and all that is extended through the city's streetcar line, and our city's streetcar system develops during that time. And up until the automobile comes along in the 1920s, this sort of spider web radius of transportation systems that reach out and extend the neighborhoods and the parks and the places people live and play and go to school. All those things are extended with our streetcar system. And Bellingham develops an elaborate, very efficient streetcar system during that time. And it really is the pencil line that kind of defines neighborhoods during that period. By the 1920s, it really is, the city limits of the populated city is getting pretty close to where they are today, really. It's hard to believe, but by the late 1920s, Bellingham's kind of reaching its size. It's continued to grow at the edges, especially more recently, but what we think of as what we perceive as the city are really taking its final form by the 1920s before we go into the Depression. The downtown by this time, and in the 19-teens and 20s, all of the businesses are getting offices, all the dentists, all the retail, all that stuff is getting downtown. The beginnings of department stores are starting to take hold in the downtown. Daily routines of people going about their business, shopping or whatever, because of the streetcar lines, it's practical to go downtown. And that becomes really the heartbeat of the city in these teens and 20s period. Tens and teens. By the 1920s, we're starting to get to where there's more prosperity. Social systems have expanded. There's entertainment. There's movie theaters. There's fraternal clubs. There are gathering places and events that happen in the downtown, and that really does pump up, really does create the downtown. When we look at the boundaries of the historic district, they really are kind of, that edge is pretty well going to be in place by the 1920s, even though a lot of the buildings that infill in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s are still within the boundary. The edges itself are starting to be formed by the social patterns that are in place by the end of the 1920s. This is sort of a unique situation in that the metropolitan tract, the metropolitan development, of which we're in one of the examples, really it's a master plan for a new center for the downtown. And the Mount Baker Theater, the Bellingham Hotel across the street, the Bellingham Towers building, the old Bon Marché building, all are built by the same investors, the same planners, and they're all planned as a single unit. Tunnels are built for services and utilities between the Bellingham building and the Mount Baker. And this whole area is kind of pretty well thought of as ultra-modern, new rethinking of the hub and center of the city. So it's appropriate that we're here tonight. So, I would say, too, in terms of the new historic district, these are going to be some of the poster buildings within the National Register district right here in the old, what was called the Metropolitan Tract. Trying not to digress. I'm so guilty of digressing. There's so many good little sub-stories that I want to get into, but I'm not going to. The 20s, and especially the 1930s, start to bring on a kind of a tumultuous change. It's the end of the 20s where I think we turn, not only do we turn away from the waterfront, I think we give up on the waterfront as a place where people go. In the 1920s, the automobile and the transportation systems and the highways, the location of the highways passing through the city, all pretty well disregard the waterfront. And we pretty well concede the waterfront to industrial development. It's really too bad, but those things that used to be, old friends going down fishing on the waterfront or boating or whatever it may be, the just lingering along, walking along the waterfront is pretty well lost to large sawmills, plywood mills, the development of industry on the waterfront. And the automobile really invites us not to go there because cars don't go to water. And so the highway system really does start to change the city quite a bit. The interstate, the main north-south federal highway, begins to change too, and it begins to go right through the center of the city, down Holly, out up Sunset, out Northwest, and north from there. So the all that new activity of cars coming and going and all those tourists and travelers all start to come right through the center of the city, and that's where the Horseshoe Cafe and the Bellingham National Bank building, all this stuff kind of develops along Holly, which was the old highway system. And Katie reminded me in the 1960s, that's why Travel Lodge is on Holly, was because it was on the travel route. Here's a look back at the building of the Puget Sound plywood mill, which became Georgia Pacific. And you can see from that other view the way that the waterfront has pretty well been conceded to heavy industry. And the city really does turn by this time away, and we've almost forgotten the ghosts of Henry Roeder and Peabody and all those guys, and now the city really is turned in and begins to grow out north, out Guide Meridian, out in that direction. The neighborhoods out by Cornwall Park and even south begin to really attract the energy of the city away from the waterfront. So you kind of get that feel in those years. This in the 1940s, and of course the war comes along, and that the industries associated with the war are a big priority, and so they easily slip into properties along the waterfront, and that really changes things. Even the Montague and McHugh building, that one of the metropolitan tracks, Montague loses everything with the Depression in the 1930s and goes into receivership. He hangs himself in his house in the North End, and the building becomes a bomb factory. So right downtown, good place for a bomb factory. By the 1950s, the war's over. Automobiles absolutely taken over. On railroad, they're turned into parking lots. Trains don't go there anymore. All the activity of the railroad era, all that romance of the age of steam is pretty well gone. Diesel trains aren't romantic, and automobiles completely take over. On Cornwall, what were once a lot of little small retail shops are given over to big department stores that take over, and Penny's and Woolworths and Sears and everybody just inflate into these giant big space takers on Cornwall Avenue. And the only problem is, where do you put the cars? So railroad becomes the solution. Not sure why this photo hangs up, but here's just one sort of nostalgic picture of them tearing up the rails on railroad. And the Leopold Hotel, which the last remnant of which, I know Bob and David are here from, will recognize the old brick Leopold Hotel is torn down, and the Leopold that stands there today is left. Leopold Schmidt ran the Bellingham Bay Brewery, which made absolutely great beer, huge brewery here in town. He also owned the Olympia Brewery down in Olympia, where it was all about the water. Oh, I didn't mean for that picture to be in there. Oops. This was the highway route. Anyway, by the 1960s and 1970s, those big department stores were being threatened by, again, the city beginning to sprawl, zoning changes, the mall gets built. The downtown really does try to hold on. By that time, the big retailers don't own their buildings anymore. They're renting space downtown, so it's easy for them to be lured out to Bellis Fair, one of the other malls out on the Guide or somewhere, and the downtown begins to really go through a sort of existential crisis in a way. in the 1970s and 80s. I was here in school at that time, and I remember the fight with Maury Pia and everybody, trying to hold on to retail downtown. Surprisingly, most cities didn't survive that experience. The development of shopping malls in the 1970s and 80s and 90s it depleted more cities than it left surviving. And Bellingham was one of the cities, I think, because of its somewhat separation, because it wasn't a suburb to anybody, was able to hang on and was able to hold on and not gut itself in terms of trying to replicate a shopping mall like so many cities that used urban renewal money and just demolished their whole downtown and tried to build competing mall-type urban planning ideas to be able to survive. Bellingham held on to the buildings that it had, and that may have been the biggest part of the history that we can't talk about in the National Register nomination. That's the history from the 70s and 80s, when the city survived that time, the economic conditions and the planning conditions. Really amazing that we have so much to work with today. So anyway, that's kind of my quick run. I probably took too much time, Michael, I'm sorry. I just did want to finally end with in looking at a National Register of Historic Places, historic district, we didn't want to leave out any of those chapters, but we wanted to be sure that the densest parts of the story, the most complete units within, made up the core and were included. So when I assume most of you have seen the boundary, the maps for the boundary. I know Katie's got them over there. They're not finalized yet, but the proposed maps are a bit gerrymandered and a bit ragged edged. But if you look at them carefully, you'll see that they include the not just a cluster of buildings, but elements and aspects of all of the chapters that we just talked about. All of those decades are all included in the story. And I really feel strongly that the National Register designation for an entire downtown, which I don't think any other city, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, of this size. I mean, Bellingham's over 80,000 people, and one of the biggest population, one of the top 10 in the state. Doing a National Register designation in the core of the downtown, most cities couldn't do it because they don't have the resources there. And then to have the resolve and the commitment to do it is really pretty extraordinary. So I know I'm thrilled for the city and really feel privileged to be a part of this process. So anyway, with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Michael Hauser, who's can fill in, especially on the 60s and 70s if you want. I'm like, or are you back?
Well, Michael has the romantic part. I have the boring part. I'm about process and what does it mean to be listed and all that sort of stuff. I want to reiterate, though, Michael's comments on the value of a historic district. And, it's these historic buildings in your downtown that really that give you the placemaking of your community. So you're not downtown Linwood or downtown Lacey. These are the buildings that give you the character and the place that says, hey, we're Bellingham, we're unique, we're different. You don't want to be out necessarily on the strip where Costco is. People want to be downtown. I want to talk about what it means to be listed, what's the criteria of being listed, and the results of listing, things like that, and a little bit about the process. And then we'll open up for questions at the end, I guess. Yeah. So generally, historic buildings are buildings that are 50 years old or older. So you got to think about that for a minute, 50 years old or older. So that means that when the National Register program first established in 1966, buildings that were only built pre-1916 were considered historic buildings. So all these buildings that you see on this slide here were outside of the period of significance. Nobody thought these properties were significant. That includes the legislative building. In 1927, it's not historic yet. It's not 50 years old. So it's Art Deco, the movie theaters. There's this great letter in our files about Constitution Tower being rejected for National Register listing because it hadn't hit 50 years old. We all love that building now, and hard to say that it wouldn't be listed. So if you go, bump up to today, 1964 is the 50-year cutoff. Yeah, hard to believe, right? So anything pre-1964, we're going to change here very soon. The next couple months, it's going to be 1965. Anything 50 years old from the date that we're talking about. So all these buildings that you see here, are going to be historic. They're going to be 50 years old. The split-level house, it's turning 50. In fact, it's well over 50 years old. The split level really shows up in the 1930s, actually. So a lot of people don't think of the split level as a historic house, but ranch houses, A-frames, all those kind of things are sort of coming into play now. And in your downtown area, we have lots of mid-century buildings, not only buildings that have been reconstituted, remade in the downtown, but newer infill structures like banks, and there's some modern churches, downtowns, and things of that nature. So good stuff, and we think all that's important. Now there are different levels of designation, and I just thought I'd point out to you. So there's local designation. Bellingham has a local historic preservation program. There's actually a state register, so it's one level up from that. It's called the Washington Heritage Register. Then there's the National Register of Historic Places. That is a national program that's run by the National Park Service that's kind of administered at the state level. Most properties that are on the National Register, by the way, are added to the National Register because of their local level significance. Those that have national level of significance really are the highest status you can get. Those are the National Historic Landmarks. These are truly the properties that have a national impact. So there's 25 in Washington State. Most of them happen to be boats, but we can talk about that in a minute. And in Washington State, we also have a barn program. We're pretty excited about that. We have just about 600 barns on the barn register. Very unique nationwide. I thought I better just tell you this right off the get-go, because this is the main question everybody wants. What does the National Register mean? What's going to happen to me? And the simple answer is, it is totally honorary. There are no strings attached to a National Register listing. It's a tool. It's a tool, and we're going to talk about what some of those tools are. There are different kind of regulations. So even though National Register status might be the highest status that you can get, you'd think, oh, most restrictive, highest status. It's actually completely opposite of that. It's when properties are added to the local register where there's the control of alterations, review of alterations, things like that. So it's kind of opposite of what you might think. So get your head around that. So no protection against demolition, no review of alterations. It's a tool. Weird, I know, right? All right, so the National Register designation of itself, and it's just general designations, seek to kind of do these three things. They seek to sort of locate the resources. They tell us the case for their historical significance and explains how the resources or resource meets a certain criteria. And I'm going to tell you what the criteria are here in a minute. So kind of those three sort of things. But there are different things that can be listed. So you can have an individual building could be listed on the National Register. You can have collections of buildings. Those are districts like the downtown that we're talking about. Collections of buildings. They usually have to be contiguous, right next to each other, a downtown, a neighborhood. There is something called a discontiguous district, which is really confusing. But let's just talk about districts being collections of buildings. Then there's sites. Things where, the battlefield site. Important things happen at this location, but there's nothing standing there. So that's kind of archaeology if you want to think about that. There's also structures. What's the difference between a building and a structure? You guys all know this, right? Yeah, I'm putting you on the spot. So, a building you're living in, you're working in, a structure is typically something that's movable. It might be a bridge, might be what else would be a structure? Help me out here, Michael. A wall. A tower, a lookout tower, something of that nature. And then there are objects. These are movable things. So actually you can list a plane on the National Register. You can list a train on the National Register. Theoretically, you can list a car, but it doesn't happen very often. But there are a couple of fire engines that are associated with fire stations that are listed on the National Register. Or even this little obelisk up there. It's technically a movable object, so that would be listed as an object. That's a marker, by the way, for Old Military Road. And then there's kind of three basic concepts that you have. So you figure out, do you have a building, do you have a site, do you have a structure, do you have an object, do you have a district? And then we're looking at three things. We're looking at integrity, we're looking at the context, the story that Michael gave us, and then the significance of the resources themselves. What's out there? integrity is always kind of the first place that we start when we're talking about the significance of historic buildings. So yeah, I'm 50 years old, but do you have any integrity? And when we talk about integrity, we're really talking about architectural integrity, and there are 7 aspects of integrity. So it's location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. It's a list for everybody, right? What's integrity of feeling? Anybody have a guess? It's a really hard one, but it's kind of what it sounds like, really. So you walk into a space, you walk into the theater, you're feeling like you're in a historic space. So that's the integrity of feeling. And then you have, obviously, integrity of location. We don't like properties that are moved. Design, the actual overall elements of the building itself. The setting. So you have a barn that's now in the middle of a Walmart parking lot. The setting's been shot. It's not an agricultural field anymore. The materials themselves, you can see the original materials. The workmanship, can you tell how it was constructed? And then feeling we talked about. And the association is the larger sort of picture. What's it connected to? So the integrity of association. So integrity is paramount. It's kind of really the point where we decide whether buildings are eligible for the register or not. When you're talking about downtown areas, we really look at just the main facade of the structure. We tend not to go around the other elevations or even on the inside of these buildings. When you're talking about an individual structure, then we look at the whole building, the inside as well. So downtowns, it's really just that kind of main facade that we're looking at. I always like to throw this in there because people ask me, well, it's in really bad shape. It's got terrible integrity, right? Well, it doesn't. It has good integrity. So the old farmstead here up in Whitman County, yeah, it's ready to fall down, but it's all there. So we like that. We like that. So that's got high integrity. And then, you might have a building like the movie theater, the Cordova Theater in Pullman. This is a building that's a 1917 movie theater, but it had this 30s alteration to it, this Art Deco marquee. So yeah, it doesn't look anything like it did when it was built, but the marquee was added. The marquee is over 50 years ago, so changes in and of itself can become important as well. If they wanted to take it back, to 1917, great, but we're saying, that marquee is just as significant as well. It's part of the history of that building. So think about that when you think about some of these buildings downtown, because a lot of them got altered in the 50s, and that's over 50 years ago, right? So some of those changes might become significant in their own right. Oh, these are just examples. I threw some fun ones in here about, things that always raises the red flag, integrity. We don't really care about paint colors like this house down here, even though it's terrible. But theoretically, paint is paint. But things like, additions where they've added the seismic bracing, really changes the character and quality of that powerhouse. That's in Renton. Or you've got in the middle there, that's in downtown Seattle, you got a building that parking garage has been added on top of this 2-story structure. Kind of a weird scenario. The building up at the top there on the right is in Garfield. They've changed the size of the windows in there. It really changes the character of that building. And then, sometimes you have to be careful when you're looking at properties. We've got a house, a historic picture of a house down here, and it had this addition. It's a nice addition. It's somewhat sensitive, I guess, but it's definitely not historic. So we got to be knowledgeable about changes to historic properties as well. Don't be fooled. Maybe that's more for me than you. All right, so if you've got integrity, what's the story behind the integrity? How do you kind of organize it together? How do you piece it all together? And Michael and his team and Lynette, they put together this great context and the history of downtown Bellingham, and they've organized it by multiple scenarios, sort of mainly in time and theme. The time being the various years, and the theme being downtown development and how that changes and what happens to the downtown. So that's one way you can kind of organize information. Once you figure out what the history is, then you got to say, well, how does it meet the various criteria? And there's 4 basic criteria for being listed on the register. Whoop. Don't want to do that. All right, the first criteria is Criterion A. This is broad patterns of history. So this is really anything you can kind of get your head wrapped around. In your case, it's commercial development of downtown. It might be social history. It might be maritime history. It might be educational history. We've got the nuclear reactor building at UW campus. It might be educational history. That's a school up in, where is that? That's in Clayton, outside of Spokane. Or governmental history, that's City Hall right here in Bellingham. There are also properties that are associated with important people. Don't be fooled by some of these stories. You may not know the story, and you may look at the property and think, well, yeah, it's been totally altered, right? And the fun one is to look at the Axtell House down there on the bottom, right here in Bellingham. You look at that property and think, well, wow, it's got a lot of changes to it, right? Well, the significance of that property is its association to Frances Axtell. She was one of the first female legislators in the country, and she actually was responsible for remodeling the house after her husband passed away in the 1940s. And so that's what we're seeing there. We're seeing the amateur architect remodeling the house to sort of meet her needs in the 1940s when her husband passed away. And, an interesting story behind that. So we've got other houses that are associated with important business people. The house down there in the middle, has anybody ever heard of, name's going to skip me now. I can't remember her name. But the house's significance is that she was the person who established Father's Day. And, it's a very modest little craftsman-style bungalow in Spokane. But she was the main proponent behind Father's Day and went to Congress and got President Wilson to declare it a national holiday. And that's the significance of the house. So interesting stories. We got a judge's house up there. A lot of properties are added to the National Register because of their architecture. And, I like to point this one out and to say that the specific criteria talks about properties that embody the distinguishing characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction. Doesn't say anything about that it has to be the best example. Doesn't say anything that it has to be a good style either. Notice style is not in there. It is talking about just a good example of the type, period, or method of construction. So if you can make the case for if you can provide the context, maybe this is just a great example of a modest craftsman bungalow from the 1920s, right? Or you have other sort of outstanding examples like these that are associated with an architect or a fun period in time. We've got the Bob's Java Jive, mimic architecture. Looks like a giant coffee pot for roadside architecture fans. Come in and get your cup of coffee, your little Java Jive. And we have a building, Frank Lloyd Wright building. That's the Tracy House in Normandy Park. That's the connection to a famous work of a master. And then we have the Bellingham Armory, a connection to an unusual period of time where a lot of armories around the state were constructed to look like forts, like a castle. The last one, which we don't use very often, is basically underground stuff or connection to archaeology, the potential to yield important information. We have few archaeological sites on the National Register, but not many, and your downtown is not being nominated under Criterion D. This does not mean that you just haven't done the research yet, so it's got the potential to yield important information. This is not about that. This is about what's in the ground and what kind of knowledge can you get after you do that, after you do your work. Well, what about these modern properties Michael alluded to? My sort of personal passion is mid-century design and post-World War II stuff. And there are things around that are, achieved significance less than 50 years ago. And you really kind of need to start thinking about these things because they're going to be gone. Because maybe some people don't appreciate them. So there are a lot of stuff on the campus here in town. Has a lot of significance, both architecturally and in terms of the growth of the college. So a lot of interesting buildings up there. Banks downtown. Does anybody like the bank up there? Are you willing to raise their hand? I think it's pretty cool. Yeah. Okay, good. So think about that. All right, so what is listed? Actually, this is what's listed sort of statewide. So there's about 1,400 listings. Now, these are individual listings. So remember, there's a district could be a listing. So if you took the number of properties in a district, the number of individual properties is probably more like around 10,000 properties. The largest historic district we have is in Tacoma, and they have about 2,300 contributing properties. So a huge number. Then we got 25 National Historic Landmark listings. Remember, that's the highest status that you can get. This is the B reactor, national sort of impact. There are various boats on the register in Washington State. Just 440 listings on the state register. 188 district listings. So you're in a very select group here. Not a lot of districts out there. And, almost 600 barn listings. We're excited about that. what is listed here in Bellingham. I didn't bring the master list. It's all online. You can find the stuff online, but I thought I'd just give you the numbers anyways. So 44 listings in Bellingham. There's 7 individual districts actually in Bellingham. Those are all residential mainly. 5 listings just on the state register and 56 individual listings. Hopefully I got my math right? 44 plus 7, close enough. Let's keep it moving. All right, here's the list of the districts in town. So Fairhaven is the example of something gone right, if you will. I mean, it's been on the National Register for a long time. Everybody knows Fairhaven. Everybody loves Fairhaven. And they love it because of the collection of historic buildings are there. And the designation has really helped it move to where that it is today. It helped it early on to sort of recognize that character and preserve what was there, while allowing infill and adaptive reuse and things like that. So that's an early one. Recently, over the last 5 years, we've had a lot of neighborhoods added to the register, thanks to the work of Katie and her group, Broadway being the latest. That was spurred on by a neighborhood group, right? By a neighborhood group, they put that one together? Seahome was a neighborhood group, yeah. All right, what do you get? Everybody wants to know, what do I get? I'm on the National Register, what do I get for being listed? Not much, at least in terms of something that's tangible, right? But you do get these things. So this is the standard kind of stuff that the National Park Service says that you get. So eligibility for federal tax credits, that's actually a huge one. However, it's based on, what it is it's based on a 20% credit based on the amount of rehab that you put into a structure. It's got to be an income-producing property, so in your downtown area, this is a great incentive because they're all income-producing properties downtown. And the idea is that you would rehab a property, 20% of the investment you can write off in your federal income taxes. So you throw in $100,000, you write off $20,000 of that off your income taxes. Great thing. Consideration in planning for federally funded licensed or assisted projects. It's a big mouthful. It's something that we call Section 106. This is the bread and butter in our office, which basically says any project out there that involves federal funds, grants, licenses, any kind of federal nexus is required to evaluate their impacts on historic properties. So we look at things like cell towers, right? It's got a federal communications permit required, FCC. So we not only look at where the tower is going in and of itself, is there a historic site there or maybe an archaeological site, but we also look at the impact, the visual impact of the tower. What is it going to do to a downtown, to a neighborhood, things like that. So we're busy looking at those. We look at bank installations, ATM installations, all kinds of strange things, a lot of HUD work. Consideration issue of surface coal mining permits. For some reason, they pulled that one out separately when they did the National Historic Preservation Act in '66. That's basically a 106 specific to coal. Grants. In the good days, they used to actually give out grant money for National Register listed properties. They don't really anymore for individual private property. So that one's kind of off the table. Special valuation. For those properties that are on the National Register and are also on the local register, you could apply for special valuation, which is a deduction in your assessed value, again, based on the amount of rehab that you put into a property. So this is a good thing because you can double dip, right? So you can do the federal tax credit, you can do special valuation as well. You're getting lots of kudos for doing your rehab and offsetting some of those costs for the greater good. The last one is association special consideration regarding building codes. So both the International Building Code, the Uniform Building Code, Chapter 4, oddly enough, allows for some waivers in the building code to allow for the preservation of design details, characteristics of your property. So the classic one that we like to think about is a porch railing, maybe on a house. So code today says it's got to be at 36. Historically, your railing was at 24. So there's allowances in the Uniform Building Code that will allow you to sort of keep that railing down at that lower level because it's really going to change the character of that property. So we always encourage people to use those code waivers, and it's a discussion that needs to happen with the local building official, but very important to Benny. These are more the non-tangible things that can happen. And remember that Michael and myself talked about the National Register being this tool, and it's a tool to do these sort of things. So it not only provides information to property owners and tourists through heritage tourism, owners just interested in the history of their property, bringing important features back. It instills a community pride and local pride, just like Fairhaven, things of that nature. A specific sort of recognition in and of itself. So everybody loves to have a little plaque on their building saying when it was built or that it's on the National Register. So that's the formal recognition part of it. Typically it spurs better infill and alterations of buildings because people are being more sensitive. They know that their building is historic and they're appreciating its history now. So that's a good thing. Increased tourism. There are people that actually go out and look for historic properties. They come to downtown Fairhaven because of that history that's there, because of those historic buildings. It's providing you that character. So we talk about it being something called heritage tourism. People call me up and want to know where properties are that are on the National Register because they want to visit those properties. And enhanced business recruitment is also something that typically happens with National Register listings, districts, in particular downtown, because people have an idea of, hey, their value is up here. It's a little bit better of a value or a different value than another downtown community that hasn't gone to that additional level of designation. Can raise public profile. That's a pretty obvious one, just in terms of all the press that you're going to get for being on the National Register. Can spur zoning changes. I always like to tell the story about one in Tacoma. In fact, it was this large historic district that I talked about. This is a neighborhood district that was single family originally. In the 1950s, the zoning got changed to multifamily. There was a lot of tear downs in that neighborhood and infills of apartment complexes, which are probably 50 years old now. But after the designation, they went back to the city and said, hey, we want to change that zoning back to single family because we want to preserve and protect what is there. So and based on the National Register, they used that as a lever to get the city to change zoning back to single family. So that was a great thing that happened. Pride in the neighborhood, lots of entrance signs, markers, things like that. There are some studies out there that show an increased resale value of properties being on the National Register. This is not your assessed value. This is just a resale value. And targeted marketing. Marketing your property as a historic property is very important as well, so people really know that history and start to appreciate it as well. I thought I'd throw in some of these slides not to diss your local program or anything like that, but this is kind of the difference that we're talking about. So we're talking about National Register. We're not talking about the local register. So there's a difference between those programs. There's a different application process. There's different regulations. There's a different form even. So National Register, totally honorary, no strings attached. That's kind of the standard, simple message that I want to get across. No review of alterations. There's no protection against demolition. So if you looked at the National Register list that I told you about, there are lots of properties actually that have been demolished, unfortunately, that are on the National Register. We're kind of in the process of going through and officially delisting properties, because that's really the worst that can happen, is that you're going to get delisted at some point. But I'm a busy guy. We're not out there, we're not in the business of delisting, so I'm not out there checking properties as I drive around the state, making sure they're still standing or making sure they're maintaining their integrity level. It's really when somebody complains that we go out and take a look at it. So no protection against demolition. All right, how does this all happen? With an individual building, owner consent is required. For districts, it's a little bit different. And it's I like to say vote, but it's not really a vote per se, because there's no ballots. What we've done here is we're having a public meeting. There's actually an official notice that went in the paper. I know along the process, the city has also done some additional outreach type of things. For all of the property owners within a designated area of a district, each property owner gets one vote. I'll use that term loosely. If 51% of the property owners do not agree with a district listing, then it dies a quick death. Nothing happens. So it takes 51% of the property owners. Otherwise, it's moving forward. I haven't heard from any anybody that's leery about listing as of yet, and I hope not to. It's a good thing, and part of the process is sort of informing everybody of what it means to be listed, which is why you're here tonight. All right, so we have a draft nomination. It's going to be finalized here probably in the next couple weeks, and it will get scheduled for the Governor's Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. This is the body in Washington State that reviews the nominations. It's scheduled for our October meeting, which is going to happen in Walla Walla. Couldn't be further from Bellingham. Sorry about that. It's just we meet all over the state, and it just kind of happened that it fell on that cycle. At that meeting, there's two votes that take place. One is to list on the state register. Happens right at that meeting. This is the group that has the power to list. The other is a vote for National Register designation. It's a recommendation to list on the National Register. Because remember, the National Register is the National Park Service program. So we will send the nomination off to the National Park Service with the state's blessing, with the blessing of the locals, with the blessing of the Historic Commission, and then they put their review on it. They don't have any kind of formal process on their end, at least in terms of a public meeting. They have kind of a two-pronged, more of a first blush process, which is, did you cross your T's, dot your I's, kind of a process, and then they have a more of a deeper sort of process looking at the boundaries and the documentation in and of itself. They legally have 45 days, but they've been taking about 60 days to list. So October, so we're probably talking around Christmas time. We'll probably hear something if everything sort of follows its pathway. This is me and my staff processing the nomination, by the way. All right, so what are some of the myths out there about National Register listing? My property value will go down. I haven't seen this proven out anywhere. Michael, have you seen this? Property value is going down because of National Register listing. Like I said, there's some studies that show property values actually go up. Somebody's going to tell me what I can and can't do. That's not true because there are no strings attached. You're going to get a bronze plaque. Everybody says, Michael, I'm on the National Register now. Where's my bronze plaque? Sorry, we don't have any money anymore. The state doesn't send out bronze plaques. We used to send out bronze plaques, but we don't. So I'll send you a link to where you can go buy a plaque. You can change whatever you want because there's no strings attached, right? National Register, totally honorary. Unless you're getting that public benefit, doing the special valuation, doing the tax credit, then there's going to be some review. But if you're just doing your thing, there's no review. Some people are concerned, well, I'm going to have to open up my property now to the public that it's on the National Register. That's not true either. Oregon has a program where they do require, if you're getting, we have special valuation. They have something called special assessment, which requires properties to be open one day a year for 4 hours, but we don't have an equivalent thing in Washington. So don't have to worry about that. We talked about grant funds. Everybody also thinks the National Register is kind of the golden ticket to grant money, and I wish it was, but funding is tight, so there is no golden ticket. What there is if you're on the National Register and you're applying for grants through some other venue, typically National Register status just gives you a little extra brownie points, a little extra panache in that sort of review process, lets the committee know that you've gone outside of your realm of normal duties, kind of sets you apart from the rest of the group. So that is a good thing. You'll have to restore it once it gets listed. There's no requirements to do that. It is what it is at the time of listing. And of course, you can demolish the building if you need to, if you want to. Hopefully you won't do that. Oh, a couple more slides left. I just thought I'd throw this in there for technical assistance. This is my office. We have an architectural style guide on the web. We talked about getting access to the National Register nominations using WIZARD, which stands for the Washington's Information System for Archaeological and Architectural Records Data. Made that up myself, thank you. So that's a good thing. It's an online tool. It's a zoom in, click on the point, you get the nomination, you get the photographs. So if you're touring around the state and you want to find out where other National Register properties, feel free to use that. It has inventory properties, so all the inventory that Michael and Artifacts did are all on there as well, and individual National Register nominations are on there, available as well. That's it. Thank you very much. It was fast. I talk fast.
Thank you, Michael. Now we will have questions and comments, and we'll start with members of the Historic Preservation Commission. If anybody has any questions of either Michael or Katie or Jackie or anybody. Or Michael. Any?
I don't really have a question. Thank you for the presentation, but I do want to just reinforce from what I know about this as an architect. This just offers a tool, as I understand it. Once it's on this district is on, projects are eligible and they become noticeable and important as an incentive to keep buildings. When you look at Chamber of Commerce brochures and other things for cities, what's the pictures they show? They show you what makes that place special. It's the historic buildings. It's the sense of place there that's not generic. And we've lost a lot of buildings in this community. And those are the things that make us special. That's all the places you want to go to. You don't want to go to Genericville out at the Guide Meridian. So this offers a tool to let things stay, and it offers, like you say, it's a bonus point if you want to go to the next level and get local registration. There are some other restrictions, but you get a lot of incentives and taxes, and like Michael was mentioning, the building code does allow a lot of flexibility, which is really important in integrity for the building and in cost saving. It's a pretty big deal. And our local building official is very flexible about doing those kinds of things. So I think from my standpoint, I think the nomination of this doesn't have any real negative side. It's only an upside. It doesn't prevent a modern building from happening, and a lot of those things can be interesting and attract economic development. And being in this kind of a district, I think there's nothing but good that can happen from it. I can't really think of a negative side of it. So I think it's a good idea.
Okay, so none of us seem to have any questions or comments. So does anybody out there in the audience want to ask a question or make a comment? You want to?
Well, it just looks like
We have a remote mic, so that way everybody can hear you. We hope we have a remote mic so everybody can hear you.
Is it on now? Here it is.
I was just looking at the map and noticing that the district doesn't extend down into Old Town, and is there just nothing of cultural significance down that way? Or historical significance, I guess?
There is, actually. There's some very important buildings down there, some of the oldest in the city and sometimes in the state. But as Michael talked about the contiguous nature of a district, if we spread it out as far as we can. That's why it has so many legs and tendrils. But going over the creek, just so much has been lost there that it was difficult to reach out.
Just curious.
Yeah. But we have had someone who owns a building down there. He wants to be a friend of the downtown historic district. So maybe we can do that.
David, did you have a question?
Michael Hauser, do you remember Allison Brooks did a study about in a community where there's historic redevelopment, every dollar that's spent on historic redevelopment returns, is it $8 in ancillary economic benefit to the community?
That's correct.
Yeah. So Bob and I are deeply entrenched in historic preservation, building ownership, and this work, and feel very lucky to be in a community like Michael Sullivan's saying that has such a wealth of historic buildings that in this case are available for a district listing. It's important work. We believe in it in terms of everything that you've been saying, in terms of our heritage, in terms of the sense of place. And as this relates to the district listing, I think it's an interesting moment where as a community we have an opportunity to ask ourselves in a very authentic way, how do we want to see ourselves, and also how do we want to share ourselves and tell the world who we are? And a historic district is an amazing and powerful way of doing that. I love when I'm driving. I live in Fairhaven. I'm driving home or either way on the freeway, and I see that big brown sign that says Fairhaven Historic District. And I have a sense of pride that, in where I live and what that means. And if I'm driving anywhere and I see one of those brown signs, if I need to eat lunch, go to the bathroom, it doesn't matter. I will pull over just because I'm curious and I want to know. And having been involved in renting and leasing space to people that live and work in these buildings, they also are typically drawn to them for the same reasons. It is sometimes difficult to define, as you were saying, Michael, that exactly what it is, but there's absolutely such a wonderful sense that we get in these historic spaces. And I have huge gratitude that we have the leadership in our city that's spending the money for this nomination and has empowered these folks to do the work, and Katie and all your work, and Jeff Jewell, all your great work, and Tara and Mayor Kelly. This is a great moment for our city, and thank you for taking it up, and we're excited. Thanks.
David and Bob both know this, but something Michael alluded to, but just in terms of thinking about sustainability and economic models for downtown, and there's the nostalgic reason to do this, and then there's the practical reason, the modern reason. Neither one's more important than the other, but when you take a historic building, an existing building, and you're going to invest in the repurposing of that building, the reuse of that building. When you choose to reuse an existing building that's already there, as opposed to a model where you're building a brand new building, the economic capture in the local community is amazingly higher. If you spend $1 million rehabbing a building that's already there, probably 3/4 of that money is going to go into labor in trades that are locally provided, plumbers and carpenters and people that are in the community. And the remaining quarter that goes into buying materials for the project is probably in small lots, traditional materials that are likely to be available through local merchants. So most of that money on that rehab stays here. Now, if you go out on the Guide Meridian and spend that $1 million on a concrete tilt-up building for a new building, every likelihood that most of that material is going to be pre-manufactured. So 70% of the cost of that building is money that's exported to the manufacturers somewhere outside the community. And it's real common that the contractor that gets picked to tilt the building up is an experienced contractor who may not even be in the local community, who's going to use equipment, and a relatively small proportion of that investment is going to go into local households and into local trades. So that dynamic alone is something that that's strengthened by the creation of a historic district that helps to divert investment into existing buildings inside. And the other big thing on the sustainability side is that existing buildings, there's an immense amount of investment of energy, time, and dollars that's already gone into building a building that more than likely predates the 1950s, which means it was built to last. It used the best technology available when it was built with the full intention of lasting as long as it conceivably could. Modern buildings just aren't built with that sensibility at all. They're built to survive the depreciation period of 15 or 20 years, and vinyl windows are just going to be, it's a petroleum product that's manufactured somewhere, and if they last 10 or 12 years, that's all you're going to get. So, there is a subtext to creating a historic district here, and that is it's a contemporary new way of looking at sustainability in terms of the urban fabric. And that's part of the sort of the intangibles that come with the listing that Michael talked about. Anyway, I want to thank David and Bob for the example they set. It's also great to have to have that kind of, stand up and be in favor of something that comes from a downtown is really, that's just an amazing, remarkable thing and a great advantage for Bellingham. So.
Anybody else in the audience want to say anything? Ask anything? Okay.
I just wanted to add to Katie, as president of the Northwest Chapter of the American Institute of Architects, we have a resource for you because as I go through this list of buildings that are in here, any building that's built pretty much after 1950, either I or there are people who know who the architects are. A lot of it says unknown, but I know half of them, at least, just myself, since I've only been here since '72, but there's people who are older. So if you want to use us as a resource, we'd be glad to help fill in that listing.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, on the back of your packets, everybody on the commission, there is an Exhibit D, which is a letter from the Bellingham Historic Preservation Commission to the Washington State Advisory Council on Historic Preservation in support of this, the last page, Exhibit D. And so I would hope somebody on this commission might move that we accept it. Oh. Okay, Alex moves. Jean seconds. All those in favor of sending this letter on, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstain, and I think Lynette has to abstain. Recluse herself, okay. Lynette recluses herself. So I think this is, the presentation is over. I think our meeting is over, but there's lots of time to ask people questions individually and look at displays, and so I hope you stick around for a little while.